Chair recognizes the honourable member for Marco City.
Thank you, bro. Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to stand on behalf of the good people of the Marco City constituency and to lend my voice to the debate on the budget. Mr. Speaker, 49 years ago, the downtrodden majority of this country started on a journey of faith. They spoke about the 10th day of the first month and invoked the imagery of the children of Israel coming out of the land of Egypt and moving toward their promised land. And 49 years later, we see the result of where we are. Our journey started as a journey of trust, Mr. Speaker, and with tremendous reverence, we invested our leaders with almost godlike powers. And that was quite appropriate at the time, because we were fighting a vicious common enemy. And we took our politics to a level where, regrettably, what was good for then continued into a season of our national existence where it is no longer good. We took democracy to the point where we took it as a sign of our fidelity that we would not question leaders. And 49 years later, after two successive governments and their cyclical presence in the chambers of governance, we see what has happened to our country. This is not a political statement. This is a statement of reality and a statement of the need for us to see where we are, where we went wrong, and how to repair the traveling journey that we started off and that we're still on. There is no doubt a crisis of trust right now, Mr. Speaker. Crisis of trust in relation to all politicians. There's this view that none of us are to be trusted, that all of us come into this place to benefit ourselves and our families, and that as we have benefited, the people have suffered. There is that view, Mr. Speaker. And there's no doubt that there has been a reestablishment of a stark economic divide between the haves and the have-nots in our country. The very spot that we started off from 49 years ago, shockingly, surprisingly, is very similar to where we are now. There's a stark economic divide. There's almost a class distinction in our country between persons in certain areas. You could point to constituencies and areas, particularly in our capital and throughout our country, and persons in others. And there's been a loss of participation by those persons in the benefits of our country. And again, that's not a political statement. That has happened over the PLP and the F&M governance. And I'm not suggesting for a second that there are not patriotic, hard-working, loyal people in both parties, both of those parties, as I have in my party. There's no doubt that there are patriotic people. The question is not what our intentions might or might not have been. The question is, where are we now, and what do we need to do to fix our country? Something is seriously wrong. We've seen an increase in our national debt, and I'll get to that a little more later. And I'm thankful that that is now being addressed, although I differ substantially in the way that it's being addressed. We see an increase in crime. We see an increase in unemployment and underemployment. We see inner city neighborhoods having been created in our nation's capital. The very thing that we started off fighting against, we see now growing within the context of the benefits that our country has generated for some people, not flowing to a significant number of people in our country. We see this, and we have to do something about this. We see a decrease in certain areas, like home ownership. We see a decrease in high school results. We see a decrease in further education as a whole. We see a decrease in Bahamian ownership of our own country. And the question is, what is happening? You know, this is symptomatic. You can see it, not just by me talking about it, but, you know, I've had this experience. You drive through the U.S. and you can tell what neighborhood you are in. You can tell about the kind of wealth of that neighborhood by the stores that you see in the neighborhood. We never had pawn shops before. Never had pawn shops. Now we do. We never had payday stores. Now we do. And what those represent is the bottom of the barrel for persons in certain classes within our country. Those represent persons taking what little material means they've accumulated over the years and cashing them in to be able to live another day. I'm ignoring the criminal element for a moment. But for the honest person, going into a pawn store and delivering over what he or she has worked for is a symptom of the crisis that we're in as a country. We see the predatory practices of the check cashing stores, the payday stores, and again, those are symptomatic of a certain kind of social environment that we never had before. And the question is, what is going on in our country? There's a growing divide, Mr. Speaker, across racial lines now, between the rich and the poor, and between, and including in that category of poor, the declining middle class. In that context, Mr. Speaker, I think the referendum results were interesting. I think they were very instructive, because there are persons who believe that those results represented some sort of anomaly, some sort of misunderstanding, or even there are persons who believe that those results represented a moral and only moral statement by the people of this country in respect of 4 referendum bills. I believe they represent far more than that. I believe the results of the referendum represents the voice of the Bahamian people having been found again by the Bahamian people. And the Bahamian people having said very openly and almost unanimously across a broad commonwealth that our country belongs to us and that we want to have a say in what happens with it. That we will not have big government, and I don't mean PLP by this. This is not the statement I'm making. We will not have big government use the resources of our government to tell us what to do, or use the resources of our government otherwise than to benefit us. I think that is what that statement was about, because it crossed political lines. It crossed all constituencies. It crossed all demographics. It was the most resounding statement that this country's ever seen, expressed in a democratic fashion. People talk about the gaming vote, but remember the gaming vote was about half the people voting and about half of them saying no. And so that represented about a quarter of the population. This vote was about half the people voting and almost all of them saying no. And this was a loud voice. And yes, I participated in that. Yes, I had a view on that. Yes, I was campaigning against that from 2013 and 14 and again in 16. But that is not the point. The point is that our people are saying something, and we do well. We would do well to listen to what that message is. I pause there only to and I will continue that commentary in a second, Mr. Speaker, but I pause there only to say this. There are some persons who played such a meaningful role in that discussion, in that debate, and who were deprecated by the commentaries of the Right Honourable Member for Centreville in congratulating the yes vote people and saying that's just a matter of time before he brings it back again. And in not using the office that he occupies to reach out and try to heal the nation again, and to recognize that the people have spoken whether you like it or not. And so I will mention a few names, because the names have not been mentioned. I just want to thank the Save Our Bahamas people for what they did, for the effort that they put in. Whether you agree or disagree, that was an exercise in democracy. And more than that, that was an exercise and an attempt to say who we are as a people from that vantage point, not that others need to agree, and to say we will stand up for our cultural and religious rights as we perceive them. And so specifically I want to thank Pastor Alfred Stewart, Pastor Lyle Bethel, and Pastor Mario Moxie in particular, and the entire Save Our Bahamas team for the gallant work that they did. I also want to mention Dame Joan Sawyer for having stepped out from her peaceful obscurity into the limelight and having taken on a role that she need not have taken on. Her reputation is safe. Her contribution to this nation is unparalleled. But she stepped out and said some things anyway. And I also want to thank in very, very strong terms Harvey Tynes, Queen's Counsel, who with me walked across this Commonwealth. And I'm a little younger than he is, and I was always walking to catch him up. And so his energy was unsurpassed, and I'm deeply honored by it and deeply humbled by it. But let's go back to the referendum as a whole. They spoke against bills. I believe they spoke against oppressive governance, and again, that's not a PLP statement, or an anti-PLP statement. That's a question of would they perceive us, all of us, the collective of us, to be doing in this House. So I applaud the Bahamian people for their voices, for having found their voices. I applaud the church for its faithfulness and having stood up for Christian values and having shepherded the people. But as I said, I do not believe the referendum results were about those 4 bills. I believe they were an expression of democracy, an expression of the people's desire and demand for good governance. So I will address my contribution to the budget, Mr. Speaker, within that context of a demand for good governance across party lines for the good of our country. You see, the people will decide who come back in this House. But while we are here to do a common work. And I just want to say a few words on that. I was surprised, Mr. Speaker, and going over some of my notes to see my first contribution to a budget debate on 12th June 2012, exactly 4 years and 3 days ago. And to see that the very issues that I raised in that budget debate, newly minted in this House, just having come in totally in awe and feeling the weight of this place, contain the very issues that I'm going to be raising now. I spoke about my concern about the impending VAT legislation and about the need for equitable taxation. I spoke about a call for mortgage relief, call for reduction in the prime rate, for us to look to unemployment and underemployment, and about the concern about the massive debt, the national debt. And on this point, Mr. Speaker, let me say it openly. I repeat today what I said in 2012, that when we came into this House in 2012, the previous administration had moved the national debt from $3 billion to $5.7 billion in 5 years. That the national debt had almost been doubled. That was crippling to this country. There's no doubt about that. People may say, oh, they had road building and they were stimulating and so on. I don't resile from what I said at that point. And again, this is not politics, this is country. The national debt has since then moved from 5.7 billion to about 6.6 billion where it stands now. It's now about 76.3% of GDP. And that's frightening. But that is a deceleration of the declining level of prosperity that we were on. It is a deceleration of the slide in our creditworthiness that we were on. And I'm grateful for that. Here's the challenge I have with it. Here's the challenge I have with it. The national debt has been curtailed on the back of the people least able to afford it. This is the same statement I made in 2012. The national debt has been curtailed on the back of the revenue from VAT. And the VAT revenue is a consumption tax revenue, not a direct tax revenue. It's a tax on what you eat and what you drink and what you use. And predominantly those taxes fall on the back of the poor and the working and the middle class almost exclusively when compared to the wealth of the richer class. That concerns me. Let's look at that, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking at the draft estimate of revenue and expenditure. Page 32. My first comment is to lend my voice to what the member for East Grand Bahamas said, that this statement that we have a $99 million deficit, I don't understand that statement. When you look at the fiscal summary, it's a $386 million deficit. And the idea that you say that a debt redemption of $287 million is a part of that, and that will be short-term and so on, doesn't address the fact that we're borrowing $386 million at this point in time. And so we're still dealing with significant debt. But look at this. When you look at page 34, Mr. Speaker, we see the revenue forecast from VAT and other taxes. When you look at the other taxes, they're marginal. They amount to less than $1 million. So essentially from VAT, for this year, 2015 to 16, this budget year, at $544 million. And we see that projected to go up to $652 million in the next cycle, $676 million after that, and a few dollars short of $700 million by the 2018-2019 cycle. That's easy to look at that as a revenue-generating machinery in an academic context. But when you look at that in the context of a country which has been in a recession, in a context of a country where so many people are unemployed, where people are having to pawn their assets now, and you look at revenue being generated solely from those people to plug the fiscal hole, there's something unseemly about that. There's something obviously inequitable about that. And the obvious question is, why are we shying away from income tax? Why are we shying away from taxes on the rich? Why are we shying away from saying, let us make this system equitable? You know what troubles me? The VAT legislation was drafted by the FNM. And I've said it before, and I'll keep saying it. I would not have been surprised if they had passed it, because that's basically the business party. But it was passed by the PLP. And it is being increased. I'm not talking in percentages, but in terms of the yield from it, in terms of the amount of money coming out of the economy. This money doesn't materialize out of thin air. It comes out of someone's pocket. And so we're talking about $550 million approximately, $544 million, having come out of the pockets of the people who are least able to afford it in this past fiscal cycle. I don't understand that. I still think that has to be corrected. Let's talk about income tax for a second, Mr. Speaker, because I believe some people are misunderstanding what income tax is. Income tax is a tax, essentially, not an indirect tax. Basically, you pay the tax as you use your money, what you eat, what you drink, what you use. Income tax is a tax on wealth. In our context, there was a time in our country where income tax would have been counterproductive to the success of our financial services sector. It would have. We were in a different world. We were in a different financial context. We were a competitive jurisdiction depending on bank secrecy, and by definition could not have had an income tax regime which would have exposed the sources of income in our country and would have overridden bank secrecy. We couldn't have had it. To be competitive, we needed to delay that implementation. This is not that world anymore. This world does not depend on bank secrecy anymore. In fact, we have gone and repealed just about all of our laws on bank secrecy. We are now competing with other jurisdictions, and we are being blacklisted and held back by the continued absence of income tax. See, we now have a concept in the international community called unfair tax competition. And that is as nefarious in the international community as drug running or anything else. Because what happens is they look at your regime and they say, you are competing unfairly and we will blacklist you just on the basis of that. So the question is, Why would we want to continue doing something that causes our financial services sector to be viewed in a negative view, while at the same time giving up revenue that we'd otherwise have? Take this example, Mr. Speaker. Let me not use the name of a bank. If any bank in this country, which is owned by a foreign interest, generates profits in this country and repatriates those profits, that bank will pay taxes on those profits in the home jurisdiction to which it repatriates them. Right. Full stop. And had we taxed them and gotten our share of that profit, they would have had a discount in their home jurisdiction for what they paid us. So why won't we do it?
Makes sense.
At the end of the day, it's the same as saying, we have taxed those banks, and instead of putting that money in the public treasury, we wrote a check to their home jurisdictions. It has that same effect. And the question, therefore, is why are we not doing it? If it's holding back our financial services sector, if it is detrimental to our national revenue, why are we not doing it? Income tax is not only a revenue tool, Mr. Speaker. Income tax is an anti-corruption tool. I want the country to hear that. I've said that in this House for 4 years. I'll keep saying it. Income tax is not just a revenue tool. It is an anti-corruption tool. Because many times you're unable to determine how someone got anything. And you're unable to determine whether they were gotten by illicit means. But you can determine whether they reported that thing in the last cycle, and you can imprison them for not having reported it. That is where we are as a country. We are at the point where we are still holding back on equitable taxation because the very people, and I'm not talking corruption here, I'm talking rich here, the very people who have the ability to determine that we bring in the source of revenue are the very people who will be most affected by it. We are representing ourselves in sticking with this type of revenue rather than going to income tax. And we are not representing the majority of people who happen to be our constituents. This cannot be right, and this is unsustainable. And the world will push us in the direction of income tax inevitably. But meanwhile, our people are suffering. Let's look at NHI for a moment. There's some talk about NHI, and I've heard members say that they're waiting to applaud the introduction of NHI. Let me just point out something. If you look in the 2015-2016 draft estimates, the one from last year, at page 130, this is what you will see. You will see an allocation at item number 911992 for the Public Hospital Authority in the year 2014 to 2015 of $200,644,000. The next year, meaning last year, there's a zero allocation, and the allocation now goes up to the National Health Insurance, item 911732 for $260 million. In other words, the tax is already being collected, and it was already allocated to the Ministry of Health. And under last year's budget, it was allocated to National Health Insurance. Well, that didn't materialize, but the point is we are already paying for public health. We're paying for public health. And if you look now at the 2016 estimates at page 305, this is what you're going to see. This is what you're going to see in 305. You're going to see now National Health Insurance revenue projection is this year was 260 million, same thing we allocated essentially, and going forward is projected 210 million a year. Here's the difference. That is now under the heading of National Health Insurance. Previously it was under the heading of the Public Hospital Authority. When it was under the heading of the Public Hospital Authority, it was taxes we were already collecting. It was an allocation in the budget already made. Now we're looking at National Health Insurance and we're saying, let's tax them a second time to run the public hospital system. Because now the revenue is not the consolidated revenue, you know. Now the revenue is not what we've already collected. Now the revenue is not even let's give them back the money we had collected. Let's give them some tax breaks to allow for that. The thing is now let's make it a second source of direct taxation. And they will say, listen, no, with national health insurance, you don't pay at the point of service. And the country needs to really pay attention to these words. All they're saying is you don't pay when you show up in the hospital for the doctor to see you, but you do pay. And I'm saying, again, we're talking about a tax on the same people who cannot afford it. We're saying on top of that, we're now going to tax for NHI. And we're saying that's what's provided for in this item 911732 under head 60 for NHI. How? The effect of that will be to put our country in an even better position fiscally, The effect of that will be that now we would have saved the $210 million that was going to the Public Hospital Authority because we will be getting it in a new tax from the people. And so the books will look good. Books will look very good. But the people will be decimated. When the people watch us in this place, what I hear out there is that there is a perception of a divide between us and them. Not just a room we're sitting in that they're not sitting in, but a perception that we live in a different world than they live in. I went to the celebration over there for the Save Our Bahamas people, whatever day that was. My days are becoming a little merged, so forgive me if I can't separate them. I think it was 2 days ago or something. It was Monday. And we went over there and we, sang and said prayers and whatever. And I'm walking to get back to my car to go to a different meeting before that ended. And there are 3 little girls on the street corner. 3 little girls in the dark of night in short pants on the street corner saying, "Hi, mister, how you doing?" to me. Right there outside Parliament. Right on Bay Street and Parliament Street. What do you think they were doing there? The prophet Habakkuk says this, and I think this is the way it ought to be. He says, declare the vision and make it plain. Inscribe it in stone that those who receive it may run with it. There should be no secret of where we're taking this country. There should be no disconnect between us and the people that we serve. But there is the perception that we are disconnected. Take this example. We have one guy who goes on social media and says he's going to go and do harm to a Chinese fellow. The police are on his doorsteps like that. He's arrested. We have people who are accused in this house of being involved in a conspiracy to commit murder. And nothing happens. Nothing happens. We have a minister who has gone and just been accused, I'm not saying it's true, of interfering with a lay magistrate. And the Attorney General's ruling is, we will not prosecute anything where there's a conflict of evidence. Nothing happens. And my question is, if that is the rule of justice, you need to go free all those people who are in jail who've never confessed. Because in every case there's a conflict of evidence. And I could go on and on and on with this. But I think the most egregious one, when you look at the budget we've just been discussing, and you look at the conversations going back and forth between the two sides, is the 52-week program compared to this apprenticeship training program. Mr. Speaker, I invite members to do this. Pick up the statute laws that we pass, go to something called the Parliamentary Elections Act that we are guided by, go to section 56 of it, clause B, and read this. The following person shall be guilty of an offense against this act. Every person who shall directly or indirectly by himself or any other person on his behalf give or procure or agree to give or procure or offer or promise to give any office, place of employment, or anything else to any voter or to any person on behalf of any voter or to or for any person in order to induce such person to vote or to refrain from voting. And then go from there to section 110. And notice what that says. Notice what that says. 104, sorry. It says anyone who does that is guilty of an offense for $2,000 or 7 years in prison, 2 years or $2,000, and shall vacate his seat in Parliament. Yet still we're in here talking about openly, yeah, you did your 52-week program, you hired people for votes. Oh yeah, now you're doing your other program hiring people for votes. Everyone sees the statute, which we have passed, section 96.4, saying no one can do that, and saying it's an offense, and if you do it, you vacate your seat, and nothing happens. Nothing happens. This cannot be right. We need to reimagine our country. And that is my real contribution, Mr. Speaker. We need to get to the point where we reimagine our country. We look at restructuring our country for the benefit of the many and not for the benefit of the few. Let's look, for instance, at this just before that, let me look at this Road Traffic Act, which I've spoken about in this House for 4 years. 4 years. Says very clearly that a livery car, L-I-V-E-R-Y, must have no more than 12 passengers. This is section 2. A taxi cab, no more than 12 passengers. A tour car, including for sightseeing tours and pre-arranged transfers, no more than 12 passengers. Omnibuses under section 80 can have more than 12, but only for public scheduled services, private scheduled services, or privately chartered services. No one else can. And yet still we have taxis going up and down, tour buses masquerading as taxis, as tour cars, where the law that we pass says there cannot be more than 12 people. And we have taxi drivers out there unable to take home any money for their families. And we hear about this in and out for 4 years in this House, and no one does anything about it. How are the people to come to any other conclusion than that there's an incentive for people in this House not to do anything about it? I'm not saying that there is. I believe that there is, personally, but I'm not saying that there is. How are people to come to any other conclusion? And if we can ignore the law, why can't others? If we can ignore the law, then what authority do we have to say to people out there when they ignore and break the law that we can punish them? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move to the Homeowners Relief Bill, Mr. Speaker, because I want to say something on that. This is the fourth year that I've seen these documents come out to say we will finally deal with mortgage relief. And let me tell you how disappointed I am with this. Let me read it, Mr. Speaker. It's a 10-point plan. I'm just going to jump to the important ones. Point number 2, the government will work to obtain, not that there's any agreement, the government will work to obtain the agreement of the bank to write off 100% of the unpaid interest. And then there's some other points. 4 points. That's the only one I'm focusing on, because point number 5 is that in return for the bank agreeing to the 4 elements above, including the writing off of all unpaid interest, the loan, the government, for its part, would guarantee the interest payment of the affected borrowers for 5 years through 2017. When you read words, the devil is in the details. So 5 years through 2017. Not from 2017, you know, through 2017. So you're talking about 2012 to 2017. You must first get them to agree to write off 4 years of interest, all unpaid interest, up to this point, and then we will give them a guarantee. Everyone knows that's never going to happen. Because when you say to them, I'm going to guarantee what your interest is, but you must write off 80% of the interest before I guarantee it, why would they do that? And then you say to the Bahamian people, oh, here's how we deal with it. You're going to have to pay a reasonable annual service fee into a fund to ensure the stability of the government's guarantee. Well, if I'm a banker or an attorney for a bank and I read that, I'll say, you yourself are saying you doubt the stability of your guarantee. You want the average person to pay into a fund to ensure the stability of the guarantee. And so where they're saving here, they're paying there, and they're already not able to pay here, so how are they going to pay into there? I've seen this type of language before, and this amounts, with the greatest respect, to a lot of blah, 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 to get us past another few months, for the people to continue to lose their homes. This is too important. This is what 1967 was about. This is why I started at that point. This is a pillar of not only our economy, but our culture. That people have houses, they turn them into homes, families are able to grow there, and people have a safe place to be. We've sat down, first as an F&M government, and watched thousands of homes being sold every day, in and out, month and month, these things in the newspaper. Came in as a PLP government, and I've sat for 4 years and have not done it yet. And now we're talking about another plan, which these are lives. These are people's lives we're talking about. And what is egregious about this is that the way to do this doesn't involve a penny out of the government's pocket. Not a penny. Give jurisdiction to the courts. I've said that for 4 years, 3.5 years, got tired of saying it, tabled the bill to deal with it. No one supports it. And I'm saying that, Mr. Speaker, for the nation to hear it. No one in the House. Oh, I'm hearing some people support it. I'm very happy to hear a couple of people support it. We have not, and Mr. Speaker, I'm saying this because having seen this, I haven't seen this so-called homeowners protection bill, but having seen these 10-point plans, I'm going to say to the Speaker, I want my bill voted on. Vote it down if you want to vote it down, vote it up if you want to vote it up. Let the people see how you regard their homes and how you regard the accumulation, the single largest accumulation of wealth that they, for the most part, will ever see in their lifetime. The only thing of substance that most of them will ever be able to pass on to another generation or sell in their later years so that they're able to go and support themselves. Speaker, I also saw the contribution by the member for Pine Ridge on the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement and other things. I don't intend to go into that, other than to say that I'm, with the greatest respect, completely underwhelmed by it. Just more talk. I intend to make my contributions on that when we have the debate on the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement. So I'm going to move past that. Because what I want to talk about is crime and punishment. That's where I want to move on to. Crime and punishment. Is there any greater obligation of a government or of a parliament than to protect the people? I mean, there can't be any greater obligation. We can't have effective crime control without proportionate punishment. It's just not possible. If the people know that you're not serious, it makes no difference what you say. I see the national televised address on crime by the Honourable Member for Bain and Grantstown, August 2015, and they've helpfully printed it out. Lots of programs, lots of talk, but how? Mr. Speaker, let's go to the Capital Punishment Procedure Act. Let me just make this very, very clear so we can stop making excuses in this place. Our Capital Punishment Procedure Act lays out the procedure for imposing the punishment of the capital punishment for capital crimes. Imposing execution for capital crimes. Capital Punishment Procedure Act is an act from 1926. It went before the Privy Council in a case called Larry Raymond Jones and the Attorney General, number 52 of 1993. Privy Council held that the imposition of the sentence of death is perfectly constitutional under our Constitution. Privy Council went on to hold that the sentence of death by hanging is a common law way of carrying out that sentence, and that is also perfectly constitutional. People say to you, oh, the Privy Council is stopping us from executing people. It is simply untrue. Either they have no idea what they're saying or they're lying. Because it is clear from the Privy Council that it is perfectly constitutional. Here's what the Privy Council has said instead. The Privy Council has said essentially this, and I could rant off a bunch of cases for you, but this is what it amounts to. Because the legislature of the Bahamas has not imposed sentencing guidelines, sentencing guidelines must be imposed by the common law. And because you haven't done it, other judges throughout the Commonwealth Caribbean have done it. The Privy Council will endorse those sentencing guidelines as the sentencing guidelines to be followed as to when to apply the sentence of death. That's what the Privy Council has said. Over and repeatedly. For those who want the cases, there's a case called Trimmingham and the Queen of St. Vincent and Grenadine case, 2009, United Case Privy Council, page 25. Ernest Lockhart and the Queen, Commonwealth of the Bahamas, 2011, Privy Council, 33, and on and on and on. Their point is, you haven't told us what the sentencing guidelines are. And so we will impose the sentencing guidelines as a matter of common law. That's all they've been saying. You read all of these cases of worst of the worst, they've never once suggested the imposition of death penalties unconstitutional. Never once. They've said, we will give you the guidelines, and we will incorporate those guidelines from other Caribbean countries, because you haven't made your own. Who makes guidelines? This House. This House. You know, I've spoken before about Machiavelli, the French author who wrote The Prince, and everyone likes to talk about his book, The Prince. He also wrote a book called The Discourse on the Republic. It's about 300-400 years old, but it's worth reading. And in that book he says this. He says, no government can exist without the right to protect its citizens through the imposition of the death penalty, and not simply to protect the person to avenge the person for the crime, but to bring finality. I think this was the genius of his statement, to the crime. Because other than that, you have the tit-for-tat thing. My guy knocks you off, one of your guys knocks him off, and it goes back and forth. I'm not talking about domestic and other issues. I'm saying that is the nature of the crimes we're facing now. And the genius of what Machiavelli said in the Discourse of the Republic is that the only person who could bring an end to that without retribution following is the state. See, people say, you know, the death penalty doesn't deter crime. Have we ever applied that reasoning to rape? Oh, we're not going to sentence anyone because that doesn't deter anyone else from raping someone else. That reasoning is a fallacious reasoning. The whole point of penalty and the point of imposition of penalties is not to deter anyone. It is to bring the disapproval of the state and the people that it represents to bear on the person who did that crime. And to bring finality to it.
To pay the ultimate price for taking a life.
We have people out there who will walk around and say, no problem, man, I'll go to jail for you. Because they believe if they kill you, they're going to jail to eat, drink, and sleep for the rest of their life. My view is very simple. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. You kill someone, you get executed. Very simple. I'm an attorney also, so let me expand on that a little bit. And it is this, that if a country is going to impose that maximum sentence, a country also has to safeguard as best it can against making a wrong decision. And so I actually advocate that where we have someone charged with a capital offense, treason or murder, that person must be funded by the state. To hire someone from the private bar, not some public defender working for the government, to represent him or her. We establish a scale of what that means. Someone gets a $100,000 scale, you're accused of murder, you go through, you can't say you didn't have a lawyer, you choose your lawyer, you get your DNA test, you're convicted, we move you on to the Court of Appeal next month. You get convicted there too, we move you on once more, you get convicted again, we execute you. Why are we afraid to say that?
One excuse after the next.
We have to reimagine our country, Mr. Speaker. I only have an hour to talk, and I'm deep into that, so I'm going to have to move quickly. The other side of crime and punishment is that we have to be meaningful about rehabilitation. Not everyone who goes to prison is hardened, and we don't want to leave them in there to become hardened. There are some offenses that need to remain illegal, but not necessarily criminal. There are some things that need to be decriminalized although they still remain illegal. Meaning that there's some things you don't go to jail for, you just pay a fine for. We cannot ruin our children's lives just by one slip here and there, and we know in our own hearts that if that happens to one of our children, they will not see the same results. It won't happen. We cannot see our children as disposable. We cannot see it. We have to make sure that they have an opportunity to move past mistakes. Many mistakes that many of us made and just never got caught for. And we've gone on to make productive use of our lives and to become productive citizens in our country. We have to look within our prison system, Mr. Speaker, and we have to start to divide the hardened offenders from the other persons. We have to build a maximum security prison at some point. We have to move these people who are these hardened offenders off this island to a maximum security prison somewhere and use the prison that we have as a center for rehabilitation. We have to bring proper educational programs into the prison. I'm not just talking about people doing woodwork and planting flowers. I mean, they could do that if they want to. But I'm talking about bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and real rehabilitation within prison. We have to. We have to take our opportunities that we have to make sure people are able to earn a living if they show themselves disposed to rehabilitation in prison. I hear the talk about the University of the Bahamas. And my party will be putting out a full platform shortly, because frankly I believe both of these parties need to go. That's just my view. But I heard the talk about the University of the Bahamas. And I just want to add this to it, that while we're talking about the University of the Bahamas, let's think beyond the usual thoughts. What is wrong with packaging that idea with a recognition that we have a significant problem in Nassau with space, and that land costs are so high that the average young person will never be able to afford a piece of land in Nassau? This is our nation's capital. What is wrong with looking at it and saying, hey, Nassau is not just an island, Nassau is a city. And like all cities, it outgrows itself. And when it outgrows itself, you need to spread to the suburbs. What is wrong with recognizing that in an archipelago, a suburb can be another island? That Andros is right there. All the land is there. The University of the Bahamas should be put there. What is wrong with recognizing that when we do that, the ferry service that goes back and forth every few hours will make moving from Andros to Nassau cheap, less time consuming from coming from South Beach to Bay Street? What is wrong with realizing that when you do that, people will now be able to afford land? We will now be at the point where we can develop another city, where we can spur on development, where we can get to the crown land we have and start to empower our people again. What is wrong with it? But we keep having these same old thoughts. Okay, what are we going to do? We're going to tax this, that again, and we're going to build roads 1 year before election, and yeah, we're going to hire a pile of people and call it whatever, and we're just going to throw the dice, see who gets in the house one more time, and carry it on again. Carry it on again. Speaker, I want to speak for a few minutes that I have left on employment. Let me just say something while I'm still on crime. Swift justice cannot mean swift convictions. That's not the same thing. That's not the same thing. If you measure the success of your Attorney General's office by how many people you convict, that is a faulty measure. We don't want convictions, we want justice. We want truth to prevail. If people get off because you've moved the system through quickly enough and they have not been proven to be guilty, that's justice. And we are equating the two. We're actually going into a kind of metering system where we're saying the more convictions you have, the more we believe that you're doing your job. And that cannot be right. Our people cannot be disposable. Just to deal with work permits for a few minutes, Mr. Speaker. You know, I'm troubled. Let me go back to the draft estimates. On page 64, we have this. We have these two figures. At the first item under 3, immigration fees, we have 46 million. Then further down, work and resident permit fees, we have 4.6 million. And so it starts to look like, okay, the work permits fee is only 4.6 million. Until I then go and look at page 41, head 6, because I assume immigration fees must be departure taxes and so on. But when you look at page 46, there's another item there for departure taxes. So I'm saying because I remember when the former member for Marco City, under the former government, said that the government was making $64 million in 1 year in work permit fees. And I've questioned that since I've come in this house every year. If that is what we're really making, this $53 million, I want to know how we justify that. How do we justify letting jobs go to foreigners that should go to Bahamians? I've heard, again, in the last few months before election, that there's going to be looking at that. 4 years. 4 years of people unemployed. 4 years of people being frustrated. 4 years of all of this. We seem to believe that we have no new sources of revenue, new potential sources of revenue, that it's tourism, financial services, and whatever else we kind of fit in. Might I suggest that, for my part, I've always disagreed with this idea of anchor projects, because it's like giving away an island to a company. I live in Freeport, I've lived through that, I don't want to see any other island go through that. That's just my view. I know other people can have different views, and they can legitimately have different views, but I have a problem with that. But if we're into this idea of expanding our tourism product through government assistance in land and subsidies and so on, why aren't we doing it for Bahamians? Where are the boutique hotels? You know, there was an idea that I tried to champion on the election circuit and tried to talk about a few times in this house of boarding houses, particularly in the city of Freeport, where we have so many apartment buildings sitting there, where a person that, where
Member yield. The chair recognizes the honourable member for Bain and Grandstown.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to move the following resolution, that the business of this House do continue beyond 7 p.m. on Wednesday, 15th June.
Thank you, honourable members. It's moved and seconded that the business of this House extend beyond 7 p.m. on Wednesday, the 15th of June, 2016. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those opposed will stand. The business of this House extends beyond 7 p.m. Member for Marco City, you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to rush, Mr. Speaker. I've mentioned that, and I just throw it out again. The reason I'm rushing is I want to get to another point. We are in a crisis in our financial services sector. Most of the people out there don't know what that means, but that's the second pillar of our economy even still. And I just want to suggest that we need to know what's going on out there in the world to properly address it. The financial services sector is being challenged because it is a no-tax jurisdiction. It's in a no-tax jurisdiction rather than a low-tax jurisdiction. I've just said everything I want to say about that on income tax. That applies here. I want to suggest that we need to look beyond, look where the world is trying to take us. In this whole idea of de-risking, for those who've been following this, and the loss of correspondent banks, what is happening now is people are just changing the wording, but they're following the same game plan. How do we trip you up? How do we make your offshore sector less productive? We used to use drug running, and now we've used all these other things. We're now moving into this de-risking idea. And how do we respond to it? I want to suggest that I invite everyone to talk about it. I want to suggest the concept of a central compliance authority. It's an easy idea. I'm an attorney. You're an accountant. We're all trying to do due diligence on someone. And when we get it wrong, the U.S. or everyone else complains about it, and the correspondent bank says, listen, you all got us in trouble. We don't want to bank with you all anymore. What's wrong with centralizing it? What's wrong with saying, here's a repository for information. We invite everyone in the world to put their bad people in it. Interpol, CIA, FBI, we've created a central compliance authority. Pool your information in this authority. Our people will check this. And when you complain that we didn't pick up that name, it's because you didn't put it in. Create a model law that emanates from the Bahamas that we export to the whole Caribbean. Jamaica has a central compliance. Everyone has a central compliance authority. In the end, those central compliance authority will feed a Caribbean central compliance authority. And in the end, we will only be individuals feeding our authority, and they will feed the other. We will get to the spot in very few years where all of the world cannot say that we did not do our due diligence. This is where we have to head. We have to reimagine our financial services sector. We have to get to the point where we can look ahead at where the roadblocks are being installed and fashion a way around them. I've been trying to say this to different agencies in private sector agencies for years. But I really suggest that we give some serious thought to that. What's wrong with marketing sovereign privacy as opposed to bank secrecy? They're very different concepts, you know. Bank secrecy is we're not going to tell you what we're doing, we're going to hide it. Privacy is you don't have any right to see it unless you prove to us you have a right to see it. It's all here. You have we have a sovereign obligation under our Constitution to protect privacy. People are in our country, so we'll protect it. Prove to us that you have a right to look at it. We need to move beyond these concepts that are holding us back. What is wrong with saying taxation is a benefit rather than as a burden? What's wrong with saying to people, you come to our jurisdiction, we're going to have a competitive tax jurisdiction, not just in a lower rate, but in what we allow you to do with your tax. You come in here, you owe us a tax of 20%. We don't have that yet, so we can actually play with that. We can say you can defer your tax obligations for a year. You can go and invest some of that in the stock market. If you have a loss, we take a proportional share of the loss. If you have a gain, we take a proportional share. There's nothing wrong with that. We can say that you're going to be able to defer taxes that are new to us again because you're spending money on your staff in the Bahamas, so you're donating to charities in the Bahamas. We need to have a serious conversation about how to move this country forward. This same old is not working. And again, I applaud the deceleration of the decline. I deprecate the backs of the persons upon whom we did that, but at least it's a deceleration. We need to get this right. I know that there are a lot of things going on out there about our reserves, and maybe this is one of the last things I want to talk on, because it troubles me when I see what is being said about what we have in this country in terms of resources. You know, when you look at our leases and you see that we're basically getting nothing from them, I think the people have a right to ask, what are we doing? When you look at the aragonite and so on that we have, no. Just 1 second for me.
Member for Marathon?
And when you see that we're basically, let me just do it from memory, basically making $20,000 a year from aragonite and royalties. $20,000 a year. How? From export of sand, 40-something thousand from memory a year. How? And I've heard the Right Honourable Member for Centreville come in the House and say, yes, there are aragonite contracts, and we've gone to the Attorney General's office, and there's nothing we can do about it. Look a little deeper. You know, Singapore faced this. Singapore faced this in the 60s. And they came up with a concept that is being tested at the Privy Council level and approved as being perfectly constitutional. It's called the presumption of corruption, which they built into their Prevention of Corruption Act, and which has been approved. It allows you to have a second look at these contracts. We need to get to the point where we are serious about what we're doing with our country. We absolutely have to. There's more I want to talk about it, but this is not the time. Just in quick passing, I personally support increasing the minimum wage to $8.50 an hour. That happens to coincide with just the basic poverty line for a three-person family under the statistics from the Department of Statistics. If we're saying that we cannot pay people enough to even reach the minimal poverty line, what are we saying? And the fact that we increase it from 150 to 210 is no answer. It should have been increased a long time ago. People cannot survive on what they're being asked to survive on. We have to be serious about looking at the prime rate and reducing it. We have to be serious about so many things in this country, but I guess the bottom line is this. We have to be serious about governance. And then I think I end with this, Mr. Speaker. What happens to our country is our decision. And I don't mean, I'm not speaking to the people in this House, I'm speaking to the people in this country. We bear the responsibility for what happens to our country. We bear the responsibility for governance, even as individuals. It is time for those persons who have a higher calling for what this country is meant to be to participate in this democracy. It is time. Because the path we're on leads to destruction. And so again, I end where I started. I'm happy that the people found their voice in the recent, their voices in the recent referendum. I believe it meant much more than the 4 bills that were there. And I encourage the people to continue to speak their voice and to participate in this democracy, to participate in making this Commonwealth better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.